Now, when I was in grad school, one of my professors talked about the three books you had to read when reading an actual book. Now, not three actual books, but three perspectives you needed to have to recognize, to really understand the book. The first was the book as the author intended it. What were their goals? How did their worldview inform their writing? And what was happening in the community at the time of the writing? Second, was the book as the original audience would have received it? What was their situation? How would they have received these words, messages, and themes? Finally, was seeing the book as you do in your contemporary context. What biases or different worldviews are you bringing, and how does that affect the way you understand the author's original message? Now, while I was studying texts that were hundreds or thousands of years old, the same principles apply in political communication because, let's be honest, the difference between the extremes of our political world can seem like folks are living in different eras. So, in today's Better Advocacy in 10 minutes or less, we're going to look at 6 steps for communicating with people from the other side of the aisle. Now, if you're in a state that's basically controlled by a single party, this can apply to communicating with different intra party factions as well. Now, the first step is to recognize your own biases. Yes, I know it's hard to believe, but not everyone shares your views, and some of those views you think are self evident might even be rejected as baseless propaganda by folks with a different political philosophy than you. Now, let's be honest with how you see the political world and the world in general, and how that impacts your view on policy. If you believe that the key to keeping people safe and secure is limiting outside bad actors by having tight borders, and you're talking border policy with someone that thinks human migration is a natural part of civilization, without recognizing your biases, you won't get very far in your policy discussion. In the same way, if you are adamant about a woman's right to bodily autonomy and believe any restriction on that is part of the patriarchy, you won't really be able to start a productive conversation about abortion with someone who sees that as a child until you see how your worldview is informing your policy decisions. Now, in order to connect with someone who sees the world differently than you have to see the world beyond your biases. In the same way, you need to recognize the biases of the target you're trying to influence. Not everyone believes the same thing because not everyone has the same life experiences. People's views are shaped by the communities they are a part of or have been a part of. This could be anything from whether they grew up or now live in more rural or urban communities, the faith or lack of faith communities they've been a part of, what type of education or career they've had, and what traumatic experiences they had and those closest to them have experienced. Those lived experiences are powerful. And if you want to influence someone, you should respect them, especially if they're different from your own. I'm not saying you have to agree with their worldview or biases, but you do need to recognize that for them, it is their truth. All right, next, you need to understand the loaded language of your issue. These are the words or phrases that the other side of the aisle is opposed to. Listen, word choice matters. People have visceral reactions to certain words. Back in the mid 2010s, moist, all of a sudden became this word that lots of people just couldn't stand. If someone used it in a sentence, it would completely derail the conversation. The same is true in political conversations. What you may think is a perfectly acceptable and even aspirational, in the best possible way, word or phrase can immediately shut down any conversation with your opponents. Think about when a liberal talks about equitable education or a conservative talks about parental rights. Both ideas sound great to their bases. And really, separate from the current political climate, both could also be acceptable to folks in general. But because of what these phrases have come to mean, they've become loaded language. Not every policy area has this, but the more your advocacy relies on grassroots instead of technocrats to get it implemented, the more likely you're going to have to understand loaded language. Now, once you understand the loaded language on your issue, you're going to want to remove that language from your vocabulary. no matter who you're talking with. There's no reason to use the language that will immediately shut down people you're trying to reach. If you continue to use it within your circles, you're more likely to unintentionally use it when you're talking with the press or even folks you're trying to influence. You'll end up with a hot mic issue that will do more harm than good. Think about it. The people in your base that use this language likely won't hold it against you if you don't use that exact phrase. But that phrase, when used amongst folks of a different political persuasion, could completely shut down negotiations. The benefits of using loaded language are so small when compared to the risks. Okay, now that you've identified a loaded language to avoid, as well as your biases and those of the targets, it's time to craft your talking points and one-pagers. Now, if you have questions about one-pagers, I've got another video. We'll be linking that here, so you can go check that out. But here's where you're going to apply everything you've learned as you've looked at your biases, the biases of the target you're trying to influence, and any loaded language. First, you're avoiding any of that loaded language. I don't care how much you and your allies use it. You know it's going to land wrong with your target, so don't even think about including it. Next, you're going to make sure that the points you're making in your talking points and one-pagers aren't relying on ideas that are givens in your worldview, but are not in your target's view. These are the biases that you recognized earlier. This means when someone reads or hears these statements or arguments, they'll be able to agree to them even if they don't share your background or political outlook. And once you're done, look over your talking points and one-pagers. If you're happy with it, then review it with an ally from the other side and be open for feedback. Let's be honest, everything I just talked about is really hard to do. Our worldviews are hard to break out of. It's hard to see your own biases or recognize the validity of your target's biases when they're not your own. That's why it's so important to have someone from that worldview, from that other political perspective, that you trust to review what you've drafted. They'll see things you didn't. They can help you fine-tune your arguments and your word choice. Listen to their perspective and experience. Being part of that community, they understand it better than you because they live it. And once you've incorporated their feedback, you're ready to go. You'll have the arguments in a one-pager that can reach across the aisle because you recognized your biases, recognized the biases of your targets, understood the loaded language of your issue, removed any of that loaded language from your vocabulary, crafted talking points and one-pagers before having any conversations with your target. And then finally, number 6, you reviewed all this with an ally from the other side and were open to their feedback. That's right, 6 steps for better communication with people on the other side of the aisle. Check out my channel for more tools to become a better advocate in 10 minutes or less on Better Advocacy in 10 minutes or less.